For 3 years, Ukraine has fought tooth and nail against Russia's invasion, but now a new front is opening, one that even the US wasn't expecting. Finland, a country that shares an 800-mile border with Russia, is stepping up in a way that has caught everyone off guard. After years of careful neutrality, Finland has gone all in, delivering its largest military aid package yet. And it's not just about weapons. This move sends a message to both Moscow and Washington. Europe isn't waiting for the US to decide the fate of this war. But what's really in Finland's massive aid package? Why is it so significant now? And what does this mean for Ukraine, Russia, and NATO moving forward? Let's break it all down. First, let's dive into the details of the most recent donation from Finland to Ukraine. The information comes from an announcement by the Finnish Ministry of Defense, which was also broadcast on the country's national TV and radio service. According to the announcement, this delivery of military equipment is unlike some of the previous donations, which were, to quote, stock deliveries. What this meant is that a portion of the military equipment that Ukraine received from Finland in the past came from the latter's own stock of existing weapons. It also means that some of the donations that went to Ukraine didn't actually contain any equipment that Finland produced natively. Instead, Ukraine used its own stock of equipment, usually Soviet-era weaponry, armor, or ammunition, as well as equipment they received from Finland that could directly complement this equipment without the need for additional training and logistics for frontline soldiers. Based on the announcement, we can surmise that at least some of the equipment donated to Ukraine in the more recent batches, so to speak, came directly from Finnish military industry manufacturers. This has multiple implications for the ongoing war, but also for Finland itself. Let's start with the fact that Finland previously sent some stock deliveries. Undoubtedly, these donations likely proved vital in the opening year of the war in Ukraine. In 2022, Ukraine's military largely had only access to weaponry that was left over in the country from the collapse of the Soviet Union. From there, Ukraine made its own improvements to the weapons to bring them more in line with contemporary designs. However, the country's arsenal was sternly Soviet-influenced. The stark differences in designs between the Soviet and Western military equipment, especially at the height of the Cold War, meant that equipment that looked similar could behave entirely differently and have separate sets of pros and cons for its purpose. As such, the Ukrainian military is primarily trained with these types of equipment and has more extensive knowledge of its possible uses and functionality on the battlefield. This came in handy with the fact that many NATO countries donated significant numbers of Soviet tanks, such as the T-72s, but modified or refurbished to allow them to function with more modern technologies, optics, and strategies. Thus, NATO providing Ukraine with similar technology, such as the aforementioned stock deliveries, meant that Ukraine could more readily deploy them to the battlefield and benefit from the heavily improved numbers. Of course, this leads into the next phase of donations, such as the more advanced systems like the Patriots, F-16s, the ATACMS missiles, or the M2 Bradley and the M1 Abrams armored vehicles. All of these weapons and equipment were provided mainly by the US, with the goal of reducing the advantage Russia has through technologically superior equipment. For the most part, this strategy has worked wonders for Ukraine so far. Bolstered with refurbished Soviet-era weaponry and equipment, the country's military has managed to turn what was supposed to be a sound defeat into a war of attrition, and one that Ukraine actually has a chance of winning, or at least coming out on a favorable footing. But are there any specifics as to what types of equipment Finland is providing in this round of donations? Unfortunately, no, although this is somewhat understandable, as pretty much every country so far has kept the contents of the bulk of its donations, at least in terms of military equipment, under wraps, unless the equipment is a game changer, such as the F-16s donated by a few European countries in July 2024. From the aforementioned announcement, the only details, if we can call them as such, are that the Finnish Ministry of Defense believes that the equipment it's sending this time will be of the utmost importance for the current phase of the war. While this narrows things down a bit, it still leaves plenty of space for speculation. What the announcement does clarify is that all the equipment will be ordered straight from the supplier and sent directly to Ukraine. This has the added effect of increasing transparency and improving the supply chain of the weapons. With the manufacturer making the weapons for Ukraine specifically, they can have more control over the final product, as well as how it's delivered to the country. But the arguably more important implication is that Ukraine will largely get fresh batches of weaponry from Finland. Why? Well, this ties back into the previously mentioned refurbished Soviet-era weaponry and equipment that was being donated to Ukraine en masse at the start of the war. While that donation gave Ukraine the ability to get weaponry on the battlefield quicker, a major boost in terms of combat preparedness, the equipment came with the downside of being refurbished, second-hand pieces that were likely already reaching obsolescence in their native countries. countries. For example, take the famed F-16s that took over a year to be approved for donations to Ukraine. The delay was due in part to Russia throwing a temper tantrum, complaining that the planes presented a so-called significant threat to Russia's sovereignty and security, which resulted in yet another threat of nuclear war. The aircraft, which were sourced from the Netherlands and Denmark, were technically all due to be retired from active service. All three countries already had contracts for newer aircraft that would modernize their fleets. As such, donating the planes to Ukraine came at a relatively low cost to their combat preparedness. A similar situation can be applied to the US-made equipment that made its way to Ukraine over the years. For example, the M1 Abrams tanks were stripped of added armor padding and turned into their export version that the US manufacturers sell abroad. This makes the tanks theoretically less survivable. However, the European Council on Foreign Relations stated that even the export version of the tank is much better than the contemporary Russian tank in terms of handling and armaments. One of the main reasons that very few countries sent modern equipment, or at least modern in relative terms, is the fear of it being captured and reverse engineered by Russia. For all its faults, the Russian military has managed to make a bit of progress in the main front line in Donbass over the past few months and retook about half of the territory Ukraine seized in Kursk in August last year. The relative stalemate in terms of territorial progress likely means that the front lines are heavily contested. This is especially true on Russia's side of the front, as it has maintained significant numerical advantages in terms of artillery numbers and readiness. This increases the need for Ukraine to use land-based donations more aggressively, which also reduces the expected lifespan of donated equipment. Therefore, it makes sense that most of the equipment Ukraine receives is older. They're not expected to last for another 20 years anyway. All they have to do is carry Ukraine through the war for the upcoming year before the situation can be reassessed. But Finland looks to be somewhat of an outlier when it comes to donations. While the most recent announcement was notable for being one of the largest investments in terms of dollar or euro values, 2024 had a few other notable pieces of news from Finland. Namely, the country's Ministry of Defense had previously stated that it was sending advanced weapons prototypes to Ukraine for field testing. This isn't a novel concept, of course. Many of the pieces of equipment that NATO has sent to Ukraine over the past 3 years have provided a treasure trove of information about their battlefield effectiveness. The reason for this is relatively simple. There hasn't been a large-scale war involving two countries that have similar technological levels and access to contemporary weapons in decades. Additionally, Russia is still one of the world's largest producers of advanced military equipment and is particularly notable for having some of the best designs for artillery and anti-air defenses. The donations are, therefore, feeding information back to their host country on what types of equipment and tactics are most suitable for a war fought between two modern armies that increasingly rely on technology, such as long-range reconnaissance and drones. One of the most prominent lessons that Western military experts have learned is that artillery is not becoming obsolete, as was earlier believed, but it is evolving. Traditional artillery is slow and needs to be set up before firing, then packed up and relocated before the enemy can triangulate the launch point and send a counterstrike. The West now favors the hit-and-run tactic, which is perhaps best exemplified in the HIMARS or other infantry support vehicles donated to Ukraine. The ability to shoot at a target and then quickly reposition for additional shots can drastically increase the survivability and operational versatility of heavy armored vehicles. Even then, there's very little information on what those prototypes might be. The best clues we have so far come from Finland's military industry complex, or more specifically the weapons manufacturer Patria. Patria, Finland's largest domestic weapons manufacturer, is a defense contractor primarily owned by the Finnish government, with the remaining 49% held by a Norwegian defense group. The company has supplied various modern military systems to both Finland and international defense forces, some of which have been deployed on the battlefields of Ukraine. One notable example is the Patria AMV, or Armored Modular Vehicle, an 8-wheeled, multi-role vehicle. A key strength of its design is its adaptability to integrate different weapon systems and technologies. This flexibility allows the AMV to serve as an armored personnel carrier, infantry support vehicle, or medical transport. Different chassis configurations exist, including high roof models used for command and transport roles, and high armament models designed to accommodate heavier weaponry. The AMV features reinforced armor plating, engineered to withstand common anti-tank mines like the TM-62s, widely used by both Ukrainian and Russian forces. Poland has acquired AMV variants, modifying them to prioritize amphibious capability over heavier armor. An area of potential improvement for the AMV system stems from issues observed with towed artillery. Patria produces a 155mm towed gun howitzer with a rapid fire rate of 6 rounds per minute and limited self-propulsion via an integrated diesel engine on a wheeled platform. In past trials, Patria experimented with mounting this howitzer onto a Soviet T-55 tank chassis, but the resulting system encountered challenges, such as diminished accuracy after repositioning and instability in long-range firing. Although Finland has not officially sent Patria's 155mm howitzers to Ukraine, it has provided older, towed artillery from its stockpiles, including Soviet-designed 2A36 Gyatsin B 152mm and M46 130mm howitzers. Since these older models align with Ukraine's existing artillery infrastructure, they are easily maintained and supplied. Additionally, this move likely represents Finland's effort to phase out outdated inventory in favor of more advanced domestic weaponry, while also ensuring ammunition capability with NATO's standard 155mm systems. A 2023 report from the Finnish news agency Yle indicated that Patria was considering manufacturing new AMVs in Ukraine, leveraging local production capabilities under licensing agreements. This suggests that the AMVs have performed well in Ukraine, likely due to their modular nature and adaptability, both crucial factors in Ukraine's ability to counter Russian forces. If we take the most recent announcement at face value, i.e. Finland funding manufacturers to directly produce weapons and equipment for Ukraine, there's a distinct possibility that these two projects are related. Finland may also be exploring the possibility of using the AMV chassis as a foundation for domestic self-propelled gun howitzers, based on Patria's artillery systems. Such a development would likely take inspiration from France's Caesar, a truck-mounted 155mm howitzer. A Patria-designed equivalent could incorporate the AMV's superior armor protection and increased payload capacity via its 8-wheel chassis. France's Caesar has demonstrated superior battlefield performance compared to the US-made M109A6 Paladin tracked artillery and the British towed M777, both of which also use 155mm guns. While approximately one-third of tracked artillery donated to Ukraine has been lost, few units have been destroyed. This highlights the benefit of wheeled artillery, particularly in terms of mobility and survivability, reinforcing the necessity of hit-and-run tactics for mid- to long-range engagements. Another Patria vehicle supplied to Ukraine is the Pacey Armored Personnel Carrier. Unlike the AMV, the Pacey is a 6-wheeled, lightly armored, fully amphibious transport vehicle. A 2022 report confirmed that at least 20 XA-185 models have been delivered to Ukraine by the end of that year. Similar to the AMV, the XA-180 and XA-185 models lack built-in weaponry, but feature a rotating turret base that allows for the attachment of a machine gun or an autocannon, transforming them into infantry support vehicles. However, details on their combat performance in Ukraine remain scarce, with reports suggesting that at least a dozen have been either destroyed, abandoned, or captured by Russian forces. Patria's advancements in the Pacey series culminated in the XA-200 series, which features enhanced armor but at the cost of losing full amphibious capability, restricting it to wading through water up to 5 feet deep. The XA-202 variant is primarily used for communications and command operations by both Finland and Sweden. A February 2022 report indicated that Patria was upgrading Sweden's XA-202 fleet to extend its service life until at least 2025. Lessons learned from the XA-185's deployment in Ukraine may influence future improvements to the XA-202 series. Most recently, Patria unveiled the Tremos, an upgraded mobile 120mm mortar system. The Tremos integrates traditional heavy mortars on a modular carriage and can be mounted on various platforms, including 4x4, 6x6, 8x8, and even tracked vehicles. The mortar system is further enhanced by an advanced recoil reduction mechanism, which increases vehicle stability and minimizes wear. A defining characteristic of the Tremos is its rapid deployment capability, allowing it to fire within a minute of setup and relocate immediately after launching the last round. This aligns with lessons learned from the conflict in Ukraine, where mobility and quick repositioning have proven critical for artillery effectiveness and survivability. So with the possibility of Finland supplying not only fresh, new weapons to Ukraine, but advanced designs that were actually field-tested and improved upon in the war, what does that mean for the balance of power in the war? Well, the effects of the donation are somewhat muted by the US pulling its financial and military support for Ukraine. President Trump's announcement the US would pause military aid means that Ukraine might stand to lose a significant chunk of the donations moving forward. For all intents and purposes, the US might be trying to force Ukraine to accept less favorable peace terms, as ending the war has supposedly been one of Trump's more notable plans from his election speeches and interviews. As a result of the change in presidency and foreign policies, European countries have stepped up by providing more support and taking the initiative on deciding whether and how Ukraine can use the donated long-range weapons inside Russia. The donation tracker by the Kiel Institute suggests that Europe had already surpassed the US as the biggest donor by the end of 2024. Given that donations from the US are currently on hold, some European countries, particularly those bordering Russia or Ukraine, might be more invested in providing more effective and modern donations. The reason for this is quite obvious: self-preservation. While there's a minuscule chance of Russia ever declaring war on NATO and trying to conquer Europe, Russia has long used politics as just another battleground to try and influence Europe and the US. The Kremlin has been accused multiple times of interfering with the US elections, and a German plan for when Russia might attack NATO during 2025 suggests that the first phase of the war will likely be political and demographic in nature. The US pausing aid to Ukraine, at least in terms of the same rate as before, means that the neighboring countries might be thinking of what exactly would happen if Russia managed to win the war after all. And for Finland, this line of thinking puts it in somewhat of a unique spot. Finland wasn't a part of the Warsaw Pact or the Soviet Union and didn't have a significant cultural influence from Russia. This makes it unlikely that Russia would attempt to occupy Finland, if it weren't in NATO in the first place, on the same grounds as Ukraine. However, Finland shares the longest land border with Russia out of all European countries, accounting for more than half of the NATO-Russia border. Additionally, the two countries were at war for most of World War II, which ended with Finland losing more than a tenth of its territory and one of its largest cities, that being Viborg. In previous years, tensions have flared between Russia and Finland due to the former attempting to push refugees across the border while disregarding the actual rules of asylum seeking. This led to Finland closing most of its border crossings. Ultimately, Finland's moves could be seen as NATO trying to rebalance itself around the US not being the shot caller for the alliance. More specifically, the US announcing a pause in funding for Ukraine opens the doors for European economic powerhouses like Germany, France, Italy, or the UK to take center stage and try to broker peace between the two countries. Regardless, the possibility of Ukraine getting modern weapons that could blow their Russian counterparts out of the water means that the front in Ukraine might not remain as unmoving as it has been these past few months. Only this time, just like with the Kursk incursion, Ukraine might make the first move to utilize its shiny new toys. But what do you think? Will Finland's aid be unveiled and actually be useful? Or is this news simply an attempt to reduce the emphasis on the US's somewhat paradoxical moves over the past few weeks? Let us know in the comments, and thank you as always for watching.